America owes $38 trillion. That's the federal debt as of late 2025. The number is so large, it stops meaning anything to most people. Let me make it concrete. If you earned $1 every second, it would take you 31,688 years to accumulate $1 trillion. America owes 38 times that amount, $38 trillion in debt. And here's what makes it impossible. America adds roughly $2 trillion in new debt every single year. Every year. The government collects about $5 trillion in taxes. They spend about $7 trillion. The gap, that $2 trillion deficit, must be borrowed. So the debt grows and grows and grows. But debt is owed to someone. When you borrow money, someone lends it. When you take out a mortgage, the bank has that money. When you use a credit card, the bank is extending credit. There's always a lender and a borrower. So here's the question that seems almost too obvious to ask, but reveals something profound when you actually try to answer it. America owes $38 trillion. Who are they borrowing it from? Who has $38 trillion to lend? Who are these creditors keeping America alive, despite debts that should have collapsed any normal country decades ago? Think about that for a moment. I need to warn you about something. The answer is far stranger than most people realize. The mechanism that keeps America borrowing trillions without consequences isn't what economics textbooks describe. It's not rational creditors making sound lending decisions. It's a circular system where America borrows from entities that need America to keep borrowing, where the lender and borrower are sometimes the same entity, where money is created specifically to be lent, and where the whole structure works only as long as everyone believes it will keep working. Once you see how this actually operates, once you understand who's really keeping America afloat, you'll never look at the US economy the same way again. Let me start with the biggest creditor, because this is where the circularity becomes obvious and strange. The Federal Reserve, America's central bank, owns roughly $4.3 trillion in US Treasury securities as of late 2025. $4.3 trillion. That's about 11% of the total debt. Now think about what this means. The American government owes money to the American government's bank. The entity that creates dollars owns dollars that the government borrowed. But where did the Federal Reserve get $4.3 trillion to lend? They created it out of nothing, with keystrokes. Let me tell you how this actually works, because the mechanism is important. In 2020, when COVID hit, the US government needed to borrow trillions fast. Stimulus checks, unemployment benefits, business loans. The spending was enormous. They issued treasury bonds. But who would buy $3 trillion in bonds in a few months? The Federal Reserve did. They announced quantitative easing. Here's what that actually means. The Federal Reserve creates dollars digitally, then uses those dollars to buy treasury bonds from the government. The government issues a bond. The Fed creates money. The Fed buys the bond with the created money. The government now has money to spend. The Fed holds the bond. This isn't lending in any traditional sense. The money didn't exist before the Fed decided to buy the bond. It was created for the purpose of lending it. The Fed essentially printed $3 trillion during COVID and gave it to the government in exchange for bonds. And here's what's strange. The government pays interest on those bonds back to the Federal Reserve. But the Federal Reserve is owned by the government, so the government pays interest to itself, and then the Federal Reserve sends most of that interest back to the Treasury as profit remittance. It's a circle. The government borrows from itself using money it created itself and pays interest to itself, which comes back to itself. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it means that $4.3 trillion of America's debt is owed to an entity that created money specifically to buy that debt. But that's just the Federal Reserve. Let me tell you about the second category of lenders, because this is where it gets even stranger. Intragovernmental holdings, $7.1 trillion. $7.1 trillion. This is the government owing money to government agencies. Social Security Trust Fund holds about $2.7 trillion in Treasury bonds. Think about what this means. Workers pay Social Security taxes. That money goes into the trust fund. The trust fund is supposed to save that money for future retirees. But instead of holding cash, the trust fund buys treasury bonds. So the government takes Social Security taxes, gives the Social Security Trust Fund IOUs in the form of bonds, and spends the Social Security tax money on current operations. Then promises to pay Social Security back later when retirees need the money. It's borrowing from workers' retirement fund to pay for today's spending. Medicare Trust Fund does the same thing. About $440 billion in treasury bonds. Military Retirement Fund holds $1.5 trillion. Federal employee retirement funds hold hundreds of billions more. Add it up. The government owes $7.1 trillion to its own agencies, taken from funds that were supposed to be saved for specific purposes, but instead lent to the government to spend on other things. This is like taking money from your left pocket, lending it to your right pocket, and calling it a loan. The government is both lender and borrower. It owes the money to itself. So far, we have $4.3 trillion owed to the Federal Reserve, which created the money, and $7.1 trillion owed to government agencies, which is the government owing itself. That's $11.4 trillion. 30% of the total debt is this circular self-lending arrangement. But there's still $26.6 trillion owed to someone else. Let me tell you who. American individuals and institutions hold roughly $10 trillion US debt. Pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, state and local governments, banks, and individual investors buying treasury bonds directly. Let me tell you a story about how this works, because the personal level reveals the circularity. There's a teacher in Ohio. She's 55 years old, been teaching for 30 years. Every month, part of her salary goes into her pension fund, the Ohio Public Employees Retirement System. That pension manages $112 billion in assets for Ohio public workers. Where does that pension fund invest? Partly in treasury bonds. They hold billions in US government debt. Why? Because treasuries are considered the safest investment, guaranteed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. So this teacher's retirement depends on the US government's ability to pay back bonds. Her financial security is tied to America not defaulting on debt. But here's what's interesting. This same teacher probably worries about the national debt. She sees headlines, $38 trillion in debt. It sounds terrifying, unsustainable. The country is drowning. But she doesn't realize she's one of the people keeping America alive. Her pension fund is one of the creditors. If America paid off all its debt tomorrow, her pension fund would lose one of its safest, most reliable investments. Where would they put $10 or $20 billion instead? Corporate bonds are riskier. Stocks are volatile. Real estate is illiquid. American savers need treasury bonds as much as the government needs to sell them. It's symbiotic. The borrower needs lenders. The lenders need the borrower. This teacher is simultaneously worried about government debt and dependent on government debt for her retirement. She's part of the system keeping America borrowing, and she's not alone. Millions of Americans have pensions, 401ks, mutual funds, insurance policies, all holding treasury bonds. They're the creditors. They're keeping America alive. And most don't realize they're part of the creditor class they imagine is some external entity. Think about that for a moment. Americans are lending money to their own government through their retirement savings, which means the debt is owed to themselves, which means it's not really external debt in any traditional sense. But that's just domestic lenders. Let me tell you about foreign creditors, because this is where it becomes truly global, and the mechanisms get fascinating. Foreign governments and institutions hold about $8.1 trillion in US treasuries as of late 2025. $8.1 trillion. That's 21% of total debt. Japan is the largest foreign holder. They own about $1.1 trillion in treasury securities. China owns about $760 billion. United Kingdom owns $723 billion. Belgium, a tiny country, owns $354 billion. Much of that is probably held by international institutions using Belgium as a tax haven. Luxembourg owns $373 billion. Similar story. But here's the question. Why do these countries buy so much US debt? Is it charity? Are they helping America out of goodwill? No. They're buying treasury bonds because it serves their interests. Let me show you how. Japan exports cars, electronics, machinery to America. Americans buy these products with dollars. Japanese companies earn dollars, lots of dollars. Toyota earns billions. Sony earns billions, all in dollars. Those companies need to convert dollars into yen to pay workers in Japan, to pay suppliers, to operate domestically, so they sell their dollars to Japanese banks. The banks accumulate dollars. Now what? If all those banks tried to convert dollars to yen at once, the yen would strengthen dramatically. A strong yen makes Japanese exports more expensive. If a Toyota costs $30,000 and the yen strengthens by 20%, that Toyota now costs $36,000 to Americans. Sales fall. Japanese economy suffers. So Japan doesn't want the yen to strengthen too much. What do? The Bank of Japan buys those dollars from Japanese banks. The central bank accumulates dollars. By late 2025, Japan holds about 1.1 trillion in dollar reserves. But you can't just hold dollars as cash. That earns no return. So where do you invest 1.1 trillion? The US Treasury market is the largest, most liquid bond market in the world. It can absorb $1.1 trillion easily. So Japan buys Treasury bonds. Japan isn't lending to America out of kindness. Japan is managing their currency to keep exports competitive, and buying treasuries is the mechanism to do it. Think about the circularity. America buys Japanese goods. Japan takes those dollars and buys American bonds. The money flows in a circle. America imports physical goods. Japan imports financial assets. Neither side is getting ripped off. It's mutually beneficial. But here's what's interesting. This system works only as long as both sides want it to continue. America needs Japan to buy treasuries to finance deficits. Japan needs America to buy their exports to sustain their economy. It's codependent, and that codependency is what keeps it stable. Breaking the cycle hurts both sides, so neither side breaks it. Now let me tell you about China, because their role is similar but the politics are different. China holds $760 billion in US treasuries as of late 2025. That's down from over $1.3 trillion in 2013. They've been slowly reducing holdings. Why? For years, China operated like Japan. They exported goods to America, accumulated dollars, bought treasuries. It kept the yuan weak, made Chinese exports cheap, sustained Chinese manufacturing jobs. But two things changed. First, China doesn't need to keep the yuan as weak anymore. Their economy is mature enough to handle a stronger currency. Second, and more importantly, they watched what happened to Russia in 2022. Russia held about $300 billion in dollar reserves. When they invaded Ukraine, the US and Europe froze those reserves. $300 billion just seized. Russia couldn't access their own money because it was held in Western financial systems. China learned dollar reserves are vulnerable to American political decisions. If you anger Washington, your reserves can be frozen. That's dangerous. So China is slowly diversifying, reducing treasury holdings, buying gold, building yuan-based trade systems. They're de-risking their dollar exposure. But they're doing it slowly. Why? Because dumping $760 billion in treasuries all at once would crash the bond market, which would lower the value of their remaining holdings. They'd lose money, so they reduce gradually, selling a bit each year. China is slowly extracting themselves from the role of keeping America alive. Not aggressively, not confrontationally, just steadily reducing their stake in America's survival. Think about that for a moment. One of America's largest creditors is deliberately, slowly withdrawing from that role because they see it as strategic vulnerability. But even with China reducing, foreign holdings are still $8.1 trillion. Who else is buying? Oil exporters. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Norway. These countries earn dollars from oil sales. They accumulate massive dollar reserves. They invest in treasuries. They hold hundreds of billions collectively. But here's what's changing. Some of these oil exporters are now selling oil to China in yuan, not dollars. Saudi Arabia joined BRICS. They're diversifying away from pure dollar dependence, which means they'll accumulate fewer dollars, which means they'll buy fewer treasuries. The mechanism that recycled oil money into US debt is weakening, not broken, but weakening, and that makes treasury financing harder. Now let me show you what all these pieces together reveal about who's really keeping America alive. Federal Reserve, 4.3 trillion, created money to lend. Intragovernmental holdings, $7.1 trillion government owes itself. Domestic individuals and institutions, 10 trillion, Americans' retirement savings. Foreign holders, $8.1 trillion on trade partners recycling dollars. Other domestic, $8.5 trillion, banks, corporations, other entities. Add it up, $38 trillion. But notice what's missing. There's no external creditor with independent money who chose to lend to America. Every category has circular or symbiotic reasons for holding US debt. The Fed created money specifically to lend. The government owes itself. Americans hold treasuries in retirement accounts because they need safe assets. Foreign countries buy treasuries because they accumulate dollars from trade and need somewhere to invest them. Nobody is keeping America alive out of charity or rational calculation that America is a great credit risk. Everyone is keeping America alive because they're trapped in systems that require them to keep lending. The Fed can't stop buying without crashing bond markets. Government agencies can't stop holding treasuries without finding other investments for trillions. American savers can't avoid treasuries because alternatives are worse. Foreign countries can't dump treasuries without destroying their own reserve values. Everyone is locked in, and as long as everyone is locked in, the system perpetuates itself. But here's what's terrifying. The system works only as long as everyone believes it will keep working. It's belief-dependent, confidence-based. If foreign countries lose confidence and sell treasuries, yields spike, interest costs explode, fiscal crisis ensues. If domestic savers lose confidence and flee to other assets, same result. If the Fed loses credibility and people stop trusting the dollar, inflation surges, the currency collapses. The whole structure rests on confidence, and confidence is fragile. Let me tell you what happens if confidence breaks even slightly. Imagine China sells another $200 billion in treasuries over 2 years. Not dumping, just steady selling. Other countries watch. They think maybe we should reduce exposure too. Japan sells $100 billion, oil exporters sell $50 billion. That's $350 billion in reduced demand. To attract other buyers, treasury yields must rise, maybe from 4.5% to 5.5%, 1 percentage point. On 38 trillion in debt, a 1 percentage point increase in average borrowing costs adds 380 billion to annual interest payments. Remember, America is already paying 1.05 trillion in interest. Add $380 billion, that's 1.43 trillion. At that level, interest costs consume 29% of federal tax revenue, nearly one-third. Defense spending gets slashed, or entitlements get cut, or taxes rise dramatically. All options are politically toxic. Or the government doesn't cut spending. They pressure the Fed to create more money. The Fed complies, creates another $2 trillion to buy treasuries, but that causes inflation, maybe 6% sustained inflation. Dollar weakens, imports become expensive. Living standards fall. Either path, the system breaks, and the break comes from a small loss of confidence. $350 billion in selling out of $8.1 trillion in foreign holdings, just 4%. That's enough to trigger crisis. The system is stable only as long as everyone believes it's stable, and belief can evaporate quickly. Now let me tell you why this makes America's situation unique and why it's both a superpower and incredibly vulnerable simultaneously. America can borrow $38 trillion and pay $1 trillion annually in interest without defaulting because everyone accepts dollars. The debt is denominated in dollars. America can always print more dollars to pay the debt. Other countries can't do this. When Argentina borrows in dollars and can't pay back, they default. When Greece borrowed in euros, they faced crisis because they couldn't print euros. But America borrows in dollars and can print dollars. This is exorbitant privilege. The ability to borrow in your own currency means you can always pay debts by creating money. Default is technically impossible, but the privilege has a catch. If you create too much money, inflation surges. The currency loses value. Creditors get paid back in devalued currency. That's effective default, even if it's not technical default. So America is trapped between two bad options if creditors withdraw. Option 1, slash spending, raise taxes, face recession and political backlash. Option 2, print money, pay debts, face inflation and currency devaluation. Neither option preserves American prosperity. Both lead to lower living standards. The only way to avoid this choice is for creditors to keep lending, for the Fed to keep buying when others won't, for Americans to keep holding treasuries in retirement accounts, for foreign countries to keep recycling trade dollars into bonds. Everyone must keep lending, and that's exactly what's happening, not because it's rational, because everyone is trapped in a system where continuing to lend is the least bad option. America is drowning in $38 trillion of debt, but the creditors keeping America alive aren't doing it out of strength. They're doing it because they're locked into systems where they have no better alternative. The Fed can't stop, government agencies can't stop, American savers can't stop. Foreign countries are slowly reducing, but can't stop completely without destroying their own positions. So America keeps borrowing, creditors keep lending, the debt keeps growing, and everyone hopes confidence never breaks, because if it does, the whole structure collapses. This isn't sustainable, everyone knows it, but sustainable isn't the goal. Survival is one more year, one more budget, one more auction. Keep the system going through today and worry about tomorrow when it arrives. America is drowning in debt, and the creditors keeping America alive are drowning with them, locked together in a system nobody can escape without mutual destruction. That's not strength, that's mutual vulnerability disguised as stability. And watching it unfold, watching debt grow, while everyone pretends it's manageable, watching creditors locked into lending because they're trapped, I can't decide if it's brilliant or terrifying. Probably both. Think about that for a moment.